Very good afternoon from Taiwan. The conference will begin in 2 minutes. 各位与会朋友，下午好。会议在2分钟后即将开始。Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the webinar on the development of digital economy in Southeast Asia and Taiwan, trade policy, business opportunities, and impacts of major regional trade agreements. This webinar is jointly organized by the Taiwan Coalition of Service Industries and the Taiwan ASEAN Study Center of the Chung-Hua Institution for Economic Research, and is supported by the Ministry of Economic Affairs and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Republic of China, Taiwan. Before we begin, let me remind all participants that we welcome all questions regarding our topic today. Please do not hesitate to ask questions or share comments in the chat box. Our distinguished speakers will answer them during the panel discussion after concluding their presentations. 在此也特别提醒有需要公务人员时数的与会朋友，请务必填写本场会议的意见调查表，并在此表单中填写完整的个人资料。今天和明天的意见调查表都需各填一次。谢谢。Ladies and gentlemen, to start us off, we are honored to have 李冠志副局长, Deputy Director General of the Bureau of Foreign Trade, Ministry of Economic Affairs, Taiwan, to give the opening remarks. He has recorded his remarks on video for us today. So without further ado, let me present you Deputy Director General Li.
Good day, all friends from industry, academia, and the government. On behalf of the Bureau of Foreign Trade, Ministry of Economic Affairs, Taiwan, I'm very delighted and cordially welcome you to join today's webinar on the development of digital economy in Southeast Asia and Taiwan. The COVID-19 pandemic has seriously impacted the entire world for more than 2 years. However, it brought a big change with strong impetus to governments to shape policies and frameworks for developing digital economy at the national, regional, and the global level. The pandemic has also expedited the tendency for private sector in adopting digital transformation to seize immense potentials of opportunities of digitalization. These benefits include to capture the increase of business opportunities, to enhance the varieties and the qualities of goods and services, to lift productivity and efficiency. and also to improve diversification and the competitiveness across segments of the economy. Over the past few years, we observed that regional trade agreements such as CPTPP and RCEP, together with digital trade initiatives like ASEAN e-commerce agreement and the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, have all contributed to international rules and government policies in a more coherent, harmonized, and rule-based approach to progress international collaboration in the digital ecosystem. We firmly believe that through digital trade-related arrangement and agreement, we can further work together with international partners to foster interoperability of standards and systems, as well as support our conglomerates, large enterprises, and SMEs engaging in digital trade and electronic commerce. We're also very honored to have prominent speakers from enterprises and think tanks in Southeast Asia for today's session. They will share their insights and foresights on the current developments and the prospect of digital economy in the post-pandemic era. Tomorrow, speakers from services sectors will also share their abundant experiences and views on the opportunities and the strategies in the Southeast Asian market. I look forward to a very successful webinar today and tomorrow, and we all can understand how business and the governments responding to the digital transformation and bring more values to us. I'd like to pay my special thanks to all the speakers and also to the organizers and the co-organizers, Taiwan ASEAN Study Center, CIER, Taiwan Coalition of Service Industries, and the Asia Pacific Service Coalition. I thank you.
Distinguished colleagues, participants, ladies and gentlemen, for those who just joined in, welcome to the webinar on the development of digital economy in Southeast Asia and Taiwan, trade policy, business opportunities, and impacts of major regional trade agreements. I'm sure you are all well aware that the COVID-19 pandemic has significantly impacted many aspects of our lives, from how we approach public healthcare to global supply chain, trade and the economy, and perhaps the way of life as we know it. However, as mentioned by Deputy Director General Lee in his opening remarks, we can also observe strong impetus for governments across the world to shape policies and framework for the development of digital economy at the national, regional, and global level. Over the next 2 days, we shall focus on the particular region of Southeast Asia and Taiwan. I believe that with our lineup of prominent speakers, this webinar will certainly be inspiring and fruitful. Without further ado, allow me to introduce our moderator for the following session, Christy Xu, Xu Zunci 主任, Director of the Taiwan ASEAN Study Center.
Good afternoon.
It is also my pleasure to present you our distinguished speakers for today's session. First, we have Ms. Rachel Teo, Lead of Government Affairs and Public Policy in Google Singapore. Next, we have Ms. Deborah Elms, Director of the Asian Trade Center in Singapore as well. And next up, we have Ms. Devi Aryani, Executive Director of the Indonesia Services Dialogue. And last but certainly not least, we have Mr. Anthony Patrick Chua, Convener of the Asia Pacific Services Coalition in Philippines. Now, before I pass the time back to our moderator, may I ask our moderator and speakers to take a group photo online together? Please look into your webcams and smile, and let me do the countdown. In 3, 2, 1. Okay, thank you very much. Now, without further ado, Director Xu, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Joseph. Dear distinguished speakers and all participants from Taiwan and across the region, welcome to the webinar on the development of digital economy in Southeast Asia and Taiwan. My name is Christy Su. I'm the moderator for the first day of the two-day event. I'm very honored to have four very important distinguished speakers with us this afternoon. They will share their view and insights either on the overview of digital economy development in Southeast Asia or the latest development in an individual Southeast Asian state. Each speaker will speak for 20 minutes, and then we will move to panel discussion after a short break. The first speaker today is Rachel Teo. Rachel leads the government affairs and public policy work of Google in Singapore. She also leads on a number of very important initiatives, including the AI, privacy, and sustainability. All are key issues closely related to the development of digital economy. She will present today Google's findings on Southeast Asia's internet economy amid and post the coronavirus pandemic. Welcome, Rachel. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Christy, and thank you everyone else who is on the call. Joseph, if I could trouble you to pull out the slides. I'm very delighted to share our findings from the 6th edition of the Southeast Asia Economy Report that we do in conjunction with Temasek and Bain in Singapore. Okay, thank you. I see the slides now. We could go into the next slide, please. Thank you. So this, as I mentioned, this is the 6th edition of the report and the second during the pandemic. What I think you will find in the next couple of slides is really an astonishing trend of digital consumers coming onto the internet economy. And while this report is fairly long, I will focus on a couple of chapters, including the major growth verticals, as well as SMEs that we surveyed in our inaugural section this year, and some of their reactions to surviving the pandemic. Next slide, please. So last year's report, the internet economy in Southeast Asia was poised to reach $1 trillion worth of gross merchandise value, or GMV, by 2030. This is the first time we're introducing a 10-year projection and outlook. We see that this is going to be propelled by a continued robust growth in e-commerce especially, which is expected to make up more of 2/3 of that GMV as online shopping becomes the norm for all consumers, probably not just in Southeast Asia. And the vibrant digital economy in Southeast Asia is already seeing signs of its future growth, with a prediction of over $170 billion worth of GMV by the end of 2022 and over $360 billion by 2025. So this is an upward revision of our forecast from $300 billion previously. Despite the pandemic, Southeast Asia has seen sustained strong growth in the internet economy that looks to outlast the pandemic, and we'll show you some of that detail in the later slides. We have 80 million new internet users and 60 million new digital consumers, 20 of which started to buy online just in the first half of 2021. And the internet economy in 2030 will look significantly different across the region, with massive expansion in the individual countries' digital economies. I forgot to mention in the earlier part of this slide that this report covers 6 major Southeast Asian economies, and it doesn't cover the full suite of ASEAN economies, but we certainly hope to introduce that as the years come by. We also will see an inaugural section on SMEs later, which has the pandemic has ushered them into the digital sphere, and 1 in 3 digital merchants believe that they would not have survived the pandemic without digital platforms. Finally, I want to talk about the funding environment that recovered strongly in 2021 as investments in Southeast Asia's internet economy emerged to $11.5 billion in the first half of 2021, and that was on par with the whole of 2020's investment value. And finally, I think later we will talk about the critical enablers for the success of digital economies, such as digital inclusion, consumer and worker protection, ESG and sustainability efforts, as well as data regulation and infrastructure. Next slide, please, Nadia. Thank you. So we saw, as I mentioned, accelerated internet access in Southeast Asia, with 40 million new internet users coming online in 2021. This brings the total number of internet users in Southeast Asia to 440 million and the region's internet penetration to 75%. Next slide, please. The rising digital consumption in Southeast Asia has seen 60 million new digital consumers, of which 20 million started to buy online in the first half of 2021 alone when we did this survey. This brings the total number of digital consumers in Southeast Asia to 350 million. The pandemic has also been a catalyst for existing consumers to increase their usage and spend on digital services, or start buying items or services in new verticals since the start of the pandemic. Next slide. It's been more than a year since the pandemic, and we still see new consumers joining the internet economy rapidly. And this is the breakdown of the 350 million digital consumers that we see within Southeast Asia. Next slide. We also wanted to highlight that the majority of the growth in digital consumption comes from non-metropolitan areas, rising to about 58% in the first half of 2021. Next slide. Catalyzed by the pandemic, existing digital consumers ventured further into online services and started buying in 4 new verticals since the outbreak began. Existing users also increased the frequency of use and spend across most verticals. This increased adoption of digital services is showing no signs of reversal, and 9 in 10 users in 2020 continue to use them in 2021. Next slide, please. This chart shows the breakdown of a number of distinct types of digital services used by consumers, and showed that consumers are using an average of between 3 to 4 new services than before the pandemic. Next slide, please. E-commerce dominates again in 2021 and is projected to propel the Southeast Asian internet economy forward in the next decade as online shopping becomes the norm for consumers of all ages. And I can certainly attest to that. In a strong lead up to 2030, the GMV could hit 120 billion by end 2021. We'll see the results of that in the report at the end of this year. And it may also reach 234 billion by 2025. In the growth in digital financial services such as e-wallets or buy now and pay later programs and enhanced loyalty schemes. The boom is also bolstered by a growing investment in logistics, which is a key enabler in e-commerce and a hyper-competitive sector that could grow even faster with innovations such as drone delivery. In the first half of 2021, we saw logistics see high investment interest led by deals such as J&T Express. Other drivers could propel the 2030 economy if current trends continue the momentum, such as online grocery, which could be nearly as large as the entire e-commerce market today if the penetration rises to that of China presently, which is about 20%. Transport and food and online media could also unlock the next wave of value and have the same contribution as the leading category of e-commerce today if the demand continues to rise in under-penetrated segments such as beyond the urban markets. We see food delivery as a bright spot. The previous slide, please. We see food delivery as a bright spot. In 2021, over 60% of digital consumers use and spend more on food delivery this year, and 22% of them started using the service in the first half of 2021 alone. Today, it is the digital service that is most commonly used among Southeast Asian internet consumers. You see the 71% up there. Future growth in the sector is expected as the pandemic eases, as consumers have grown accustomed to the convenience, enjoy more competitive offerings, and as more food delivery players expand into adjacent and popular verticals like groceries. Next slide, please. This is the reason why we don't believe it is a one-off phenomenon, and we think that it will be a new way of life for the Southeast Asian digital economy. Next slide, please. This wave of digital services shows no signs of reversal, with 9 out of 10 users continuing to use them in 2021. And here you'll see the breakdown of the sustained growth in each vertical. Next slide, please. And I'm very excited to introduce this chapter. So this was the first year that we introduced an SME-specific chapter, and we surveyed them, finding that 1 in 3 digital merchants believe that they would not have survived COVID-19 if not for the platforms. They found business continuity on these platforms, and over 90% of merchants now are starting to accept digital payments as well. In the next 5 years, 8 in 10 of them anticipate more than half of their supply purchases and sales to come from online sources. Next slide, please. For digital merchants, going online has been imperative for them to ensure business continuity, and as I said, 33% of merchants would not have survived if not for digital platforms to sustain their revenues, or that they felt that their sales would have declined or hit zero during the pandemic. While most digital merchants have a positive outlook on platforms, profitability remains their top concern, and they shared that digital platforms should offer more discounts or lower their transaction fees for sellers. Next slide, please. In this wave, we see that digital merchants are embracing end-to-end digitalization efforts, including front-end digital tools and also solutions to enhance their operations. I talked about the use of online payment services and e-wallets. We anticipate that merchants will continue on that suite. I certainly see that in Singapore, and it's an area of partnership across all our Southeast Asian markets with the different governments. Next slide, please. And in this wave of digital transformation, it is not only in digital marketing, but we also see many more use of cloud services, storage, and collaboration options that are adopted by these digital merchants to raise awareness, but also to improve productivity. Next slide. As I mentioned, most merchants anticipate that their sales and procurement will come online in the years to come, and we are excited to work with them to ensure that they are able to adopt these solutions at scale and quickly for their businesses. Next slide. So in conclusion, Southeast Asia's economy was resilient in 2020, but we see that in 2021, its revitalization has propelled the region to $170 billion worth of GMV, and we fully anticipate that within the next decade, it will exceed $1 trillion worth of GMV. Next slide. We wanted to also, in the spirit of this presentation, share about the impact of digital economies on exports and show that there is a disproportionate benefit to the adoption of digital technologies, especially for the SME tier. And in my last slide, next please. I wanted to conclude by talking about the critical enablers for the digital economy in 3 new buckets. So first is cross-border data flows, in making sure that there are robust and high-quality digital trade agreements that allow for the free flow of cross-border digital trade. This year is proportionately affected for SMEs, especially as data localization regimes can cause additional friction for SMEs that they may find it hard to overcome due to the lack of scale. We think that high-quality digital trade agreements with enforceability would certainly help here. For digital inclusion, it's also important that underserved segments of consumers and merchants have access to digital tools that includes digital literacy and education. And finally, we want to encourage policymakers and companies to come together to resolve digital regulatory fragmentation, which we not only see in Southeast Asia, but also elsewhere around the globe. Fragmented regulation hurts the whole internet economy and prevents the economy from reaching the potential that it could, as I articulated earlier. And I think that there continues to be a need for transparency and discussion around trade rules that will allow the vibrancy of the internet economy in the future. Thank you very much. And I cede the time back to Christy, please. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Rachel. Thank you very much for your very fruitful presentation on your new survey. I'm particularly interested in the SME special chapter because here in Taiwan and other Southeast Asian countries too, the SME and the micro business are actually a very important part of our economy. So we may come back to that during our panel discussion. Now, the second speaker is a longtime friend of mine, Deborah Ames. She's the founder and executive director of Asia Trade Center based in Singapore and vice chair of the Asia Business Trade Association. Having been working on economic integration issues for more than 50 years, Deborah is probably one of the most prestigious experts on CPTPP. the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, and RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. And she has provided consulting to various governments and business communities. Deborah today will focus on the digital trade rules of the CPTPP and other trade agreements and their impacts on and opportunities for business. Now, welcome, Deborah. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. If you can pull my slides up, I'll get started. I'm really happy to have followed Rachel and the discussion that Google has led on the penetration of digital economy, especially into the smaller businesses. I think if you haven't been reading the economy reports over the last 6 years, I highly encourage you to look at those now because they really are a treasure trove of information. And I think they're critically important for policymakers as we try to design digital trade-friendly policies that will work for the future. So I think it's great that I have followed her. And again, strong kudos to Google for spearheading this effort. Hopefully you will expand that study to all 10 ASEAN economies because we tried to use it in some work that we were doing with ASEAN. And because it didn't include all 10 members, there was some pushback from some of the excluded countries for using that as a benchmark because they said they weren't included and therefore we couldn't use that as the sort of measurement tool for ASEAN's own e-commerce efforts. So please get all 10 in so that we can use it in the future. All right, what I'm going to do then is to pick up with the end of what Rachel talked about, which is how do we use trade agreements as one mechanism or one tool to help deliver stronger digital economic growth heading into the future. Next slide, please. We all know that COVID, of course, has had a disproportionate impact on life, of course, but also digital trade. Those firms that are online have outperformed companies that are entirely offline. But before everyone panics, let me just say that there will continue to be offline engagement shops and offices, but it will be supplemented or augmented by online or digital trade. And the more that we can create a supportive policy environment, the more we can support businesses, especially the smaller firms that dominate Asia, and allow them to participate in what they do best without being strangled by complexity and costs. It's important to remember that these digital trade rules have to support these small businesses. That's sort of upside down from the way many government officials tend to think about trade, which is they focus on the largest companies and then they miss the impact of many of these increasingly complicated digital rules and the way that they affect the smallest firms the most. Government, it should be clear, doesn't have to do it all. So governments, I'm not suggesting that you create your own platforms or that you design your own training initiatives and so forth, but rather that you get the policy settings right and then you allow firms to get on with what they do best. The next generation of trade agreements, as I'll talk about, include lots of useful provisions around digital. Next slide, please. We used to have trade agreements, we used to have digital trade and e-commerce, which flourished, of course, without hardly any rules and regulations. And many governments have the misperception that no rules is what business actually wants. In fact, business prefers to have some rules, some sort of guardrails, some sense of what the environment will look like. So no rules is a problem for firms. What they want is consistent rules. They want to make sure that we avoid regulatory fragmentation that divides up the digital space, especially by geographic boundaries, so that you would have different rules in one government versus another government. That is a major problem for small businesses that do not have the resources to handle overlapping and inconsistent regulatory rules. So we need to make sure that we have consistency in trade rules that work for the smallest businesses. And one way to do that is to start thinking about digital rules in trade agreements. It's a sort of structure or an architecture or a framework that's very comfortable and familiar for most Asian governments. And you can then add a sort of digital or e-commerce element into that and help provide better consistency, better interoperability of rules around the region. They can either be part of an existing trade agreement or they can be a completely independent digital-only deal, as I'll talk about in just a second. Next slide, please. We have lots of ways to do this. And if you look across Asia, you will see lots of different approaches. I would say one of the earliest chapters in this region was an ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand trade agreement from 2010 that had a pretty extensive e-commerce chapter in it at that time. Lots of other trade agreements in and around the region have other digital elements or e-commerce elements. ASEAN has lots of work that it's been doing on e-commerce, including its own e-commerce agreement that is now active and in force. And RCEP, which is a larger grouping of all 10 members of ASEAN plus China, Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, also have digital rules. I'll talk about in just a second. There are some global talks happening in the World Trade Organization for e-commerce. The TPP, or CPTPP, as I'll mention in just a second, has a lot of digital elements in it. The US is now promoting something called the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, or IPEF, which is in part around digital trade rules. And all of these different elements of trade rules are now supplemented by digital-only agreements, digital economy agreements, and digital economy partnership agreements. And I apologize for the alphabet soup. That's something that trade officials happen to love, is making lots of acronyms. And so we have a lot of those in the digital space. The point of that is that there is a lot of activity taking place in this region to create consistent rules and regulations that govern the digital space. The problem, of course, as you can see from my sort of alphabet soup on this slide, is that many of those rules, you need to be very careful that they don't suddenly conflict with one another. So as we're busy creating rules, we have to make sure we're keeping an eye on what all of the other governments are up to, so that we don't create inconsistencies or even worsen the inconsistency problem that we have in digital trade here in the region. Next slide, please. Now, they're all different. It's not just the e-commerce chapter that matters in there. It's also things that enable e-commerce trade in goods, like things that we deal with at the border, customs paperwork, issues around e-signatures or electronic signatures. How can you submit documentation back and forth electronically? So it's about the movement of goods, but also the sort of paperwork attached to that that needs to be moved online. It's also about the delivery of services, and many firms, especially many small firms and women-owned firms, are actually in services trade. And so if we don't get the rules right for services trade, then we also stop lots of small businesses from engaging in trade, everything from consulting and training and teaching to graphic design and architecture services. So there's a lot of things that small businesses can do digitally online, but those need to be consistently implemented across the region to really facilitate trade. And then we have other elements as well, which I won't get into, like intellectual property rights consistency in the digital space. Next slide. Typically, we talk in the trade space about e-commerce rather than about digital trade. The rest of the world, the business community, talks more about digital trade as the umbrella of which e-commerce goods trade, you order groceries online, you order a book and it comes to your house, is a piece of this larger umbrella. Trade gets it upside down. And this point is just to say that no matter how you phrase this, whether it's e-commerce or digital trade, the point is there's a lot of things, a lot of moving parts that you need to reflect on in order to make the best possible outcome. And the goal ought to be to allow a micro multinational, which is now what you think of when you think of one small business in your living room creating, I don't know, some handcrafted item and then selling it online to a global customer base, to allow that micro multinational to find markets, materials, suppliers, and customers everywhere. We want to encourage that development of the digital economy. Next slide. There are a couple of issues. I'm just going to go through a few of these. I'm not going to get into the details since this is not really a policy thing, but just to say there's a lot of things that one could add to a trade agreement that deals with digital economy, including some of that stuff on customs to move goods across borders much more quickly. Also, more efforts to deal with payment, because if you can't get paid for your goods and services, then small businesses can't obviously compete in the global economy. A lot of information around data and information, cross-border information flows, and new kinds of emerging issues around cloud-based services, Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, and so forth. And in order for government to keep up to date on all of these emerging issues, it's very important that they engage regularly with stakeholders. So if you are in a business, I encourage you to talk regularly with government so that government has some better sense of what it is you do, what it is you would like to do, and what it is that is causing you heartburn, so that they might possibly fix some of those problems that you have in engaging in digital trade across borders. Next slide, please. I'm just going to quickly, because I was asked to mention some agreements and compare them. 3 agreements that are of potential relevance to this audience are the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP. You may know that Taiwan has applied to join the CPTPP. It's already been in force. We have 9 countries who are participating in CPTPP now, and the UK is currently in accession talks. China, Taiwan, and Ecuador have all applied to join as well, and we're expecting something from Korea in the relatively near future. So CPTPP already in force, growing over time. Another agreement to watch in this space is called the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, or DEPA. It brings together Chile, New Zealand, and Singapore. It is an independent agreement, so it's meant to stand all by itself and allow new countries to join in DEPA. Korea has already asked to join DEPA. There are also digital economy agreements. I don't know why we don't have more creativity in naming things, but there you go. So the DEAs are signed by partners like Singapore and Australia, Singapore, Korea, Singapore, UK. You see a bit of a pattern here, that are designed to repeat existing trade agreements that they have in place and upgrade the digital elements. So the DEPA, which stands by itself, is a little bit different from the DEAs, which are designed to be hooked to a larger trade agreement. So it's like an update of a chapter of a larger trade agreement. So let me just show you briefly on the next slide how common some of the elements are across these. And I realize that the information is small on the slide. You'll have access to the slides after the presentation, so you can read them in more detail. But the point is, because we have similar countries in all of these 3 agreements, they have similar types of provisions. But you also can see, if you look at these 3 columns, that the column on the far right, which is CPTPP, has more red X's than green check marks. Now, that's not to say that they're more useful than others. It's just to say that the CPTPP, which was one of the earliest agreements in this sort of new modern digital economy space, didn't cover as many things as the latest and most up-to-date agreements, like these digital economy agreements between Singapore and Australia. So we have an evolution over time, but there's also consistency across time. And I think that that's very helpful for companies, because it means we're getting similar kinds of rules in very different markets. And that matters for companies, and it especially matters for small companies. The next slide. It just says, again, why do we have this variation? Partly it's timing. If you went earlier, you were less ambitious. If you've had a little more experience, you can add more things in. And the more you work together, the more comfortable you are, the more trust you may have in your partners, and the deeper the agreements can be. So we have some differences between them based on timing, based on their comfort level of working together. Also, because in some instances, if I'm making an independent agreement, I have to think differently about it than if I'm making an agreement that is tied to some larger infrastructure. So the bottom line is that there are lots of different ways that we can get consistency in digital trade rules. And we see at least 3 examples that I've just provided here. The next slide. I want to talk about one other large agreement that often comes up when we talk about Asia, which is RCEP. So the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership is now in force for 12 economies in Asia. It does not include Taiwan, but it does have an e-commerce agreement. Now, the problem with the e-commerce agreement in RCEP from the perspective of a company is that what we often call the big 3 are excluded, or essentially excluded, which is, I won't get into the customs moratorium here, but one is about protecting the flow of information across borders. The second is, where do we have to host data? Can you use cloud-based services? Do you have to make sure that you have domestically based servers? Those are excluded or carved out of RCEP. And so that is an illustration of the challenge of trying to create consistent digital rules. Some governments are more enthusiastic about it, other governments more reluctant. And the net result is often inconsistencies in rules in digital, which is a problem if you think about, back to Rachel's point about the growth of the digital economy in the region. The more inconsistencies we have in rules, the harder it is for firms to get online and provide goods and services, and the harder it is for customers to access new and innovative solutions in the goods and services space as well. Next slide, please. There are a number of emerging issues. I'm just going to mention them very briefly. So we have lots of solutions happening, I think, in digital and digital trade, but we also have some things to keep an eye on and watch out for. One of them is a widening inequality in the digital space, particularly around access and affordability. Has been an issue for a long time. It continues to be an issue. We have some real challenges around doing electronic payments across borders. You may start to see digital payments being used domestically in new and innovative ways, which is fantastic. But if you travel, that's very difficult. And an example that I've been giving lately is, if you travel and you have the Grab application on your phone out of Singapore and you're in Thailand, it doesn't work. So this inconsistency between countries can be an issue in payments. There's also new rules coming on digital taxes, which again, I won't get into except to flag it's a problem for companies, especially smaller ones. There's some worries about competition policy and how governments might respond to the concerns about platform dominance to either break up or make it more challenging for platforms to operate in different markets, which may affect ability of smaller companies to work with platforms or customers to use platforms. And then these new technologies, of course, which can be extremely disruptive. The net result of all of that is it's been a real challenge for governments to keep up with the kind of innovations that businesses are rolling out. And again, I would highlight to all of you businesses on the line, please make sure that you continue to reach out to your government and other governments in the region so that they get some better education themselves about the kinds of rules that make sense to you and the kinds of rules that are deeply problematic for you and your business models. Next slide. This is the last thing, again, just to highlight that engaging with government is absolutely important because we have this range of agreements that we've created on digital, but we haven't really implemented most of them. And so governments are trying to figure out what do I need to do in order to implement the commitments that I've made or make new commitments. And that requires very tight engagement between governments and companies around digital trade policy. Because otherwise, government is likely to do things that are very problematic for businesses, not on purpose always, but sometimes more as an unintended consequence. So it's really crucial that we have this continued stakeholder discussions between government and business and consumers to try to create a platform for digital economy growth that will lead to the sort of bright future that the economy report that Rachel pointed out at the outset continues. So let me stop there, and I'm happy to take questions from you at the end of this session. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Deborah. That is really a lot of materials and information for us to take back home for further research and exploration. I understand that we have a lot of people coming from the government here taking care of these economic integration issues, and a lot of researchers and business people here. I think your presentation really very helpful. Okay, so thank you very much. The next speaker is Devi Aryani. She is the Executive Director of Indonesia Services Dialogue Council, which is an independent council focusing on policy and regulatory reforms for services development in Indonesia. Debbie will bring to us today her observation on the rise of e-commerce in Indonesia, the largest economy and market in Southeast Asia, and the opportunities for business community. Debbie, you may take the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christy. It's a pleasure to be here. Good afternoon, everyone, distinguished speakers, panelists, and guests. It is our pleasure to be able to sit here and share with you the progress and prospects of Indonesia e-commerce landscape. So if you can help put up the slide. Thank you. So let me start with giving you some illustrations about how big Indonesia digital market is. So if you look with the total population of 272 million, the penetration for internet users is quite high at 175 million. And then the mobile users, if you look at it, the number is exceeding the number of population. And this is because it's not uncommon for Indonesians to have multiple numbers. So if you see the mobile users is a lot more than the population, it's because many Indonesians are having multiple numbers of mobile phones. Indonesia also has a high numbers of the active social media users at 160 million. And the online consumers are about 138 million. So it is a big market. And this has made the Indonesia is the lucrative market for investment, especially in digital sectors. Next slide, please. So to give you some illustration on how big is the digital economy market. So this is the data that's also taken from Google studies. You can see the pre-pandemic, the Indonesia digital economy market is about 40 billion. And it is driven mainly by the e-commerce sector that's driving the growth. And next slide. And if we look at the pre-pandemic, pandemic, and the post-pandemic outlook, even during the pandemic, the digital economy in Indonesia is able to record double-digit growth across all sectors. And if you see that in 2019, it was the market size is about 40 billion US dollar, and then by 2021, it has already been at 70 billion, and it's projected at 146 billion US dollar. So this is a big market to tap into. Next. If we dissect it a little bit further, we can also see that the e-commerce is the one driving the growth. And this is also aligned with our further study because next, please. The increase in e-commerce sectors is pretty much because there's a significant increase in terms of digital adoption during the pandemic, whereby there's a new users growth, there's a new merchants online, because due to the pandemic, the increase in the total transaction is also significant in terms of the healthcare purchase as well as the primary goods transaction. This has contributed to the increase in the digital economy sectors, particularly in the e-commerce sectors. And our study, ISD study, next slide, please. Yeah, we have conducted a study to MSMEs in Java and Bali, and our study shows that the e-commerce use by the MSMEs, it has helped them survive the pandemic. In fact, it has helped them to grow the business with the expanded customers around 31%, as well as cutting down the cost of operational. In terms of marketing costs and logistic costs, it has been able to reduce by 16% and then increase the income by 24%. So this is a promising outlook by how the MSMEs are using digital delivered services via e-commerce platform. Next, please. So Deborah before has already extensively discussed about the challenges in terms of regulatory and policies surrounding e-commerce. And if I can just summarize it here, there are at least 5 that we can cluster it of the issues surrounding e-commerce. The first one is being, well, Indonesia with the 65 million MSMEs, a large portion of it are coming from the informal sector. So many merchants are not yet having the business license or the business permits. So this has been the issues as well. And then there's a taxation that was discussed earlier by Deborah. And then there's also the illegal imports that's not going through the proper importations process. And then there's data governance, data localization is included in there. And there's content moderation as well. So these 5 areas are contributing to the barriers of entry of MSMEs into the digital ecosystem. And it's also raising the cost of regulatory compliance for the MSMEs to participate in the digital economy platform. Next slide, please. So in summary, it is a big market in Indonesia. It is the biggest and the fastest growing in Southeast Asia, with e-commerce driving the growth. It is projected to be at 104 billion for e-commerce in 2025, and that's about 70% of total Southeast Asian market, an estimated growth rate at 18 to 20% growth rate. And this growth in e-commerce sector has driven a lot of the investors in the digital startups in Indonesia, not just in the e-commerce sectors, but also the fintech sectors, the e-wallet sectors, as well as the logistics sectors, all in the ecosystem of the e-commerce. And to sustain this momentum of growth, there's a need to enhance the digital ecosystem through regulatory framework that will be able to minimize the barriers of entry, reduce the cost of compliance, and support the technology innovation at the same time. So I will leave my presentation at this point. I will welcome further discussions later on. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Debbie, for that very insightful presentation on the market of Indonesia. Last but not least, and also the only gentleman among the lady speakers today, Antonin Patrick Chua. Patrick is currently the convener of the Asia Pacific Services Coalition, the APSC, which is the world's largest network of services industry and major business associations in the Asia Pacific region. On national level, he is the coordinator of the Philippine Service Coalition. Today, Patrick will talk about the development of digital economy, the growth prospect, and digital transformation in the Philippines. Patrick, please.
Thank you very much, Christy, and thank you to Taiwan Coalition of Service Industries and the Chung-Hua Institution for Economic Research, Taiwan. It's an honor to be here and share the virtual floor with distinguished speakers. I would have to apologize in advance if my feed may come in a little bit choppy, but I hope that the digital technology I'm using right now will cooperate. So in the interest of time, to the next slide, please, and so we can have more time for a discussion, let me now proceed to my short presentation. I will be talking about the digital economy in the Philippines, prospects for growth and transformation. I hope to cover these areas, the Philippines digital economy at a glance, then talk very briefly about the challenges, as I would like to focus more on the prospects in a COVID scenario, and then the updates and moving forward. So next slide. The Philippine economy in recent years has grown steadily at around 7% annually, which is one of the fastest in the region. It's also among the fastest growing market for digital trade, owing to the large consumer base that is well equipped in digital technologies. This is the Philippines digital economy in a nutshell. The presentation will be shared with everyone. So let me just zoom in a few points from this illustration. So for the next slide, according to the latest Digital 2022 Global Overview Report, the Philippines was the #1 internet user in the world in terms of the time spent online using any device. To 11 hours of daily average screen time. Arrows point for your quick reference to the Philippines and as well as to Taiwan numbers. To top it off, 76% of the Philippines, close to 112 million people, and this is as of January 2022, are active internet users. So that is over 85 million, or more than 3.5 times the population of Taiwan. With a significantly young population, a median age of 26.3 years, there is the potential to harness the opportunities created by digital trade to maintain its growth momentum. Given this demographic, however, the impact of digital trade to the economy may look both promising and wanting. So, next slide. In 2018, the economic value of digital trade enabled benefits to the Philippine economy was estimated to be worth around 3.2 billion US dollars. And it accounts to about 1.8% of our GDP. Now, given the right policy environment, it is expected to grow to $37 billion by 2030. And this is at the back of an emerging hub for e-commerce and a major player in business process outsourcing. In terms of exports, digital goods and services are the country's sixth largest export sector and account for 5.4% of total export value. The export of digital and digitally enabled goods and services, such as e-commerce, amounts to 3.7 billion in 2018, and it is expected to grow 218% to reach 11.8 billion by 2030. Backed by strong government support and accelerated by the pandemic, the Philippines' digital sector contributes significantly to economy today. In 2020, the internet economy in the Philippines was estimated to be worth 7.5 billion, and this expected to grow by 30% annually, or around $28 billion by 2025. By 2021, last year, the government estimated the revenue at $17 billion, and it's projected to increase to 25 billion by 2025, and then by $92 billion by 2030. Google commissioned study by Alpha Beta to examine the economic significance of digital technologies in the Philippines finds that if leveraged fully, digital transformation can unlock over $100 billion worth of annual economic value in the Philippines by 2030. And next slide. That said, like any other economy or country, this is a promising sector, but it's not without challenges. Digital export revenues from e-commerce have been significantly low for the Philippines. E-commerce accounts for measly less than 1% of total sales in the country. This is mainly due to the inadequate ICT infrastructure, which directly affects the availability and accessibility of fast, reliable, and affordable internet. I have to say though that, if for those who are unfamiliar, similar to Indonesia, the Philippines is an archipelago of many thousand islands. So in 2016, the country had the lowest reported internet speed in Asia Pacific. So consequently, this affects realizing the promise of digital integration, including the basics of e-governance and digital transactions to facilitate ease of doing business, as well as financial inclusion, which enable e-payments and reaching the unbanked. More specific concerns with digital transformation include the low digital adoption among MSMEs, the lack of holistic approach to policy formulation and implementation, as well as the lack of awareness of existing programs and policies to facilitate digital adoption. There's also gaps in access to digital tools and a digital skills gap in the workforce. Again, I have to say that this is not a challenge local to the Philippines. So next slide. With all these issues, from physical to structural interventions, both from the government and the private sector, are critical as several measures would show immediate impact. Recent data shows significant upgrade, although still with a wide room for improvement. The Philippine fixed broadband speed now ranks 63rd out of 178 countries, while mobile speed ranks 89th out of 138. President Duterte's announcement and order that streamlined the speed of the issuance of the local government permits sometime in July 2020 generated a significant increase in permits granted to telecom companies. Right now, we have more major players in the industry. And this would result in improvement on internet speed, largely attributed to the development as telcos are able to fast track the building of infrastructure in particular the cellular towers and fiber optic network, which is necessary in boosting services and connectivity. Moreover, the COVID-19 pandemic has provided the necessary push. A rapid assessment survey on e-commerce and the use of internet for business in 2020, conducted by the Philippines Department of Trade and Industry, or DTI, found most businesses were not connected online prior to the strict lockdown. Due to health restrictions and the closing of businesses, there was a steep drop of more than 50% in the total sales, which prompted the adoption of e-commerce. By the end of 2020, there were almost 90,000 newly registered business names for online stores. Prior to placing the imposition of quarantine from January to March, or the first quarter of 2020, there was over or almost 5,000% increase from the 1,700 registered business names for online stores. So e-commerce adoption in the Philippines increased to 80.2% this year, up from 70% in 2019 and 76% in 2020. And next slide. Essentially, the study on e-commerce in the Philippines looked at the challenges and opportunities, which I have earlier mentioned, on e-commerce, both in the world and the Philippines, and in the face of the pandemic. What I wish to emphasize from this table is that as the world economy goes digital, so is global trade. With the growth in cross-border business activities, barriers to regional trade are highlighted. However, what were earlier identified as challenges in the Philippines and by other economies now requires regional and global interventions. Domestic concerns on internet access, cybersecurity, and customs procedures and taxation are regional strategy. As investment in activity, not just in terms of technology and infrastructure, but also in the necessity of forming regionally recognized cross-border standards and regulations. So for the Philippines, we have adopted a relatively open stance on issues related to digital trade and the regulation of data flows. There's no regulation that limits the free flow of data in the Philippines. And also, the Philippines is participant in the APEC cross-border privacy rule systems that facilitate cross-border data flows while protecting consumer privacy. Debbie mentioned earlier about the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and I believe this is also one of the issue. CBPR is one of the issues being discussed at the will be discussed at the forum. While the Philippines may be relatively slow in engaging in multilateral agreements on digital trade, significant measures have been adopted in the recent period, particularly over the pandemic. We expect the ratification of the RCEP, of the Regional Economic Partnership, when Congress resumes session. While the Philippines is not a party to CPTPP, the government is consciously monitoring its progress. The Trade Department has recently launched the e-commerce roadmap for the Philippines, which seeks to advance cooperation on cross-border digital trade as a core process. And this includes ratifying the UN Electronic Commerce Convention and strengthening ASEAN Consumer Protection Network. As an APEC member economy, the Philippines also shares the consideration of the next generation trade issues, such as on digital. Next slide, please. The stringent economic restrictions imposed by the Philippines on foreign direct investments in sectors relevant for digital trade and on foreign investment in general are slowly showing signs of easing up. Also, in line with enhanced engagement with international community, at least 3 laws have recently been passed that is expected to improve the investment climate in the Philippines. The Public Service Act, which removes some foreign equity restrictions, thereby allowing 100% foreign ownership in telcos and other public services as defined. The Foreign Investment Act, which allows foreign investors to set up and fully own domestic enterprises, including SMEs. The Retail Trade Liberalization Act, which reduces the minimum paid-up capital or investment requirements for foreign retail enterprises. As mentioned, the Philippines e-commerce roadmap envisions 1 million e-commerce businesses by 2022, which is up from 500,000 last year. The roadmap focuses on building an AI research hub and through public-private partnership. It will serve as a hub for scientists and researchers to seek to apply AI to precision agriculture, healthcare, and smart cities, among others. The Taiwan leads in this field, and so our cooperation and continued partnership will be mutually beneficial for both. And then the Philippines also intends to train a digitally literate workforce to support the expanding e-commerce industry. Now, by this, however, I wish to emphasize that competent workforce do not necessarily dislodge our local workers, but augments the shortage in another economy. More so, it allows technology exchange and improved expertise, optimizing investment returns. Next slide, please. So, moving forward, in a globalized world, these measures benefit not only the Philippines, but the region as well. We need policy shift and change in perspective in order to embrace new technology and business models. To do this, as I identified in the previous slide, we must localize. By localize, it's just a play of word for global and local. Our goods and services, as well as the corresponding strategies, measures, and interventions that we have in our economies must complement with what is done and what we do across border. Of course, there are due considerations with domestic priorities and realities in our respective jurisdiction. But it is important to remain open in order to take advantage of the global economy that has now gone digital. This will help in realizing the opportunities of digital trade that will enable the industries, particularly MSMEs, to achieve cost efficiencies, enter new markets, and generate richer insights from data. It will support collaboration, enable adoption of efficient business practices, and support optimization of the global supply chain. Now, let me end my presentation with this quote from our innovation champion in government, our Vice Minister in DTI, which said, investments in new technology, digitalization, and innovation are also investments in resilience, sustainability, competitiveness, and long-term business growth, which are all necessary as we enter our economic recovery. I think this quote will serve not just for the Philippines, but for ASEAN and for Taiwan and for everyone else. So we hope that through this dialogue, we continue to collaborate and complement our strengths and our weaknesses. That would be all. Thank you very much, Christy. And again, apologies for if my feed is a bit rusty. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Your presentation is perfectly okay. I want to thank Patrick and also Rachel, Deborah, and Davey for your great presentation. According to the schedule, we still have 10 minutes to go, but I think if you agree with me, we can close this session earlier so we have more time for panel discussions, because I do see a lot of very important questions collected by my colleague for the speakers to answer. So I'll now have Joseph to take it from here.
Thank you, Director Xu. We are well ahead of our agenda, so let's take a 15 minutes break instead of 10. It is now 3:37 in Taiwan, so we'll be back at around 3:53. And in the meantime, feel free to leave a question or comment in the chat box. We'll be back and with another round of discussion on the topics, issues, or questions that you have raised in the chat box. So be sure to join us once more in a short while. Thank you. discussion, Director Christie would like to go through the questions with you. So
Yeah.
can you switch on your webcams if you're there? Welcome back to the webinar, and many thanks to the audience for all the questions and comments. We are ready to begin our panel discussion. You can continue to comment or put your questions up in the chat box. We'll update it to the moderator and the panel of speakers. Let me pass the time back to our moderator, Director Christy. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Joseph. Welcome back to the webinar for the panel discussion. My colleagues have collected questions sent to us earlier and also the questions posted by participants in the chat box in the previous session. There are some very important questions. I will now invite our speakers to respond according to the questions addressing them. So here is the first question. I guess it's addressing Rachel. It says the Southeast Asian country have a very wide development gap between the more developed states and less developed states, namely the CLM country, meaning Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar. Will development of digital economy further widen that gap? And what can be done to ensure the CLM country, the less developed country, can also benefit from digital economy? And this also responds to earlier Deborah's call for inclusion of the 10 Southeast Asian countries into a Google survey and all digital economy plans. Rachel?
Thank you, Christy. And absolutely, I think we are committed to being on the track to include all 10. I'm working very hard on that. I think that, you know, in terms of digital inclusion, we certainly hope that the benefits of the internet economy will also extend to our neighbors, CLM and I guess also B. And I think that from our perspective, it's a good starting point to think about internet access and making sure that penetration is wider, funding into digital infrastructure, logistics to enable things like we talked about, ride-hailing, groceries, online delivery, but also more fundamental tenets such as talent development in the digital economy, and finally, building consumer trust. If you go onto online platforms and you don't feel like you can trust it because of fraud or scams, that inherently is going to deter adoption. So I think that, you know, that would be our encouragement as a first step. And that's also built out in a little bit more detail in the economy report for anyone who is interested to read that. Thank you, Christy. Back to you.
Also, further question to you, from Google's perspective, do you find any market potential in these less developed countries so far, or it still takes some time to develop into a more potential markets for you?
From a Google perspective, I can share publicly that I think we certainly felt that Myanmar was on a very strong growth trajectory prior to the military takeover. I think now that the future is a little bit put in question, but certainly from the other markets as well, we see that they are emerging, but a little bit slowly. And the constraint for us has been that there hasn't been enough data to be able to meaningfully incorporate that into the report. So we're in a little bit of a chicken and egg situation, I would say, when it comes to getting the right and robust data to include in this report.
Much for Rachel. And coming back to Deborah, you mentioned about the inclusion of all Southeast Asian states in the bigger digital economy development plan. And what is your response to your suggestion to government or policymakers here to help develop this less developed country in terms of promoting digital economy and also digital trade?
It's a good question. I mean, one thing that I would say for the audience is that you may be surprised, actually, if you don't follow digital economy developments in the region, by how advanced a country like Cambodia has actually been in the digital space. They have invested quite a lot from the government and from businesses. They have some extraordinarily innovative, I think, smaller businesses who are in digital services or in, you know, e-commerce, trade and goods. And they have a government that is deeply committed actually to helping facilitate trade in their digital economy, including launching recently a specific marketplace for Cambodian small business sellers, which I think again, I don't think a government actually should do that, but I understand the incentives for a government to make sure that they provide opportunities for small businesses to flourish. And so again, for me, useful is to remember that your development status doesn't necessarily reflect your ability to engage in the digital economy. Sometimes we have less developed countries that are much more ambitious than you might expect, and we can have some more advanced industrialized economies that are actually less digital and online than you would expect given their developmental status. So this is one of those areas where I think the promise of digital trade is that even poorer developing countries, remote areas, rural populations, disadvantaged groups have an opportunity to leapfrog sometimes what you might anticipate as the more advanced forward-leaning areas. And I think that's very, again, so the promise for me of the digital economy is that anyone from anywhere can access goods and services and become part of a global trade environment.
Yes, thank you very much. You mentioned about Cambodia being very aggressive trying to promote this digital space. And Cambodia is the chair of ASEAN meetings this year. And also, I noticed that you have been providing consulting to government of Cambodia. So can you elaborate more on the role Cambodia as a host country can play in terms of promoting digital economy in ASEAN this year, probably next year?
I think that's very useful. I mean, so as you mentioned, Cambodia is the ASEAN chair this year, and part of their objectives has been to really push ASEAN as a region to become more integrated in the digital space and to implement many of their commitments. So as an example, ASEAN has an e-commerce agreement that came into force at the end of last year. There is now a 5-year work plan in place to implement that agreement. And Cambodia has been pushing its ASEAN colleagues fairly hard, I think, to actually implement the work plan that was agreed by all 10 members. Because only when the government actually delivers on all of these plans and projects do you get outcomes that matter for companies and for citizens. And I think, again, for me, Cambodia has done a nice job of seizing this opportunity, especially as ASEAN chair, to continue to promote digital integration. And of course, all of ASEAN, like the rest of the world, has been much more open to the idea of doing things digitally as a result of COVID, travel restrictions, including, I would say, holding meetings for ASEAN online. And Thailand is doing something similar for APEC. Both of these economies have had to shift to more online activities than ever before. And they've shown that it's possible for many government decisions to be made in a remote setting without having the face-to-face meeting for every single kind of decision. And I think, again, kudos to governments, in my view, like Cambodia and Thailand, for showing that this is possible even within ASEAN and or APEC. Because otherwise we would be stuck. We would have had 2 years of sort of no decision making at all. And so having that initiative, I think, is very useful. Last year in APEC, New Zealand held the entire APEC year online. They decided early on, and they moved every single meeting to an online virtual setting, which was exhausting, especially if you were in New Zealand with weird time zones. But I think it just showed what is possible in a digital space. And I think that kind of experience should reflect and flow on to the creation of a more favorable set of policy recommendations for the future, including dealing with some of these infrastructure gaps, because clearly you can't participate if you can't get online, if your broadband isn't stable, if your mobile access isn't available, if you don't have affordable internet access, then you're left out of an increasingly large part of the economy going forward.
Thank you very much. That is really very helpful. Cambodia may be a less developed state, but as far as Taiwan is concerned, it's one of the very important investment destinations for our business there. And I know that a lot of small small-sized Taiwanese company, they are trying to promote services, including digital service to Cambodia business community. So thank you very much for that answer. And also, I would like to move to Patrick because Debra mentioned about the role of APAC. Patrick has been, I noticed that you have a very long working experiences working with APAC and APAC Business Advisory Council. Can you comment on the role that APAC can play in promoting digital economy in this in the Asia Pacific region?
Just to continue with what Debbie described under the chairmanship of New Zealand last year. This year, under Thailand's chairmanship, we actually started going back to the in-person meetings. So this is, to us, since we are the ones, the business sector are the ones who are pushing for the opening up of the economy. So we feel it's to our interest, and we're compelled to walk the talk and be an example how we need to begin the opening up of businesses. And as mentioned, we are starting with that. We had our first in-person meeting last February for the Business Council side in Singapore, and until the end of this year in November, when we will have the summit, Thailand intends to hold it physically. That said, the value of APEC and ABAC, the structure is that while it is not similar to ASEAN as it is non-binding and by consensus, the discussions are so, I would say, structured in such a way that the private sector is intertwined in the process. So we are able to voice our inputs, our feedback directly to the ministers. In the case of the Asia Pacific Services Coalition, we work closely with ABAC and APEC in holding public-private dialogues. Taiwan Coalition of Services Industries, Devi Ariani of ISD, and Debbie has been partners and our great resource persons to provide this push. So I think there's the value of the APEC and ABAC in showing that more than ever we need public and private sector in more closer collaboration and engagement. And in discussions wise, we are now talking more and more about digital. There's a dedicated committee on digital. Before, we have our working group where the digital is kind of subsumed into every working group, but for purposes and because it has gone that significant, that merits its own dedicated responses and approach, then I think 2 years ago we started to have our own digital working group. So I think in essence those are the key items that I can share about APEC and ABAC.
Thank you very much for your explanation of APEC's work. I think what Asia Pacific region is better than other parts of the world is we have a lot of existing mechanisms and institutions, including ASEAN, APEC, CPTPP, RCEP, and a lot of 10+1, 10+3 mechanisms. So what we do is to put all these initiatives together so they can have more synergies. David, I wonder, do you have any comments to that question? Because Indonesia is a very large country, and also you have those more developed regions and less developed regions or islands. So do you have anything to comment on this question?
Yeah, I think the government of Indonesia has actually developed a roadmap in terms of digital transformation to help the MSMEs and also to address those in remote areas. So this digital transformation roadmap includes improvement of digital infrastructure, as well as there's some initiatives that is currently being collaborated with the digital tech platforms in order to address digital literacy. So MSMEs are being addressed as well in terms of upgrading the skills in terms of digital literacy, and currently it's still ongoing, and the roadmap itself it's made until 2045. So it's still a long way to go. It's baby step that's currently being taken in place.
Thank you very much. I also see a number of questions regarding Taiwan's application for the CPTPP. So definitely these questions go to Deborah. Taiwan has applied for CPTPP membership. What do you think would be the major areas that Taiwan has to change or improve its policy or regulation in order to comply with the digital trade rules or the development of digital trade in the CPTPP? And also to that question is, what can business in Taiwan prepare for further cooperation with Southeast Asia when Taiwan becomes a part of CPTPP in the future, and vice versa? How can Southeast Asian business work with Taiwan to take advantage of Taiwan's CPTPP membership in the future? Deborah?
Good questions. So if I'm talking just about digital trade, I would say Taiwan is quite well structured already to be part of CPTPP in the digital space. Already generally aligned, allows information to flow, etc. Has privacy protection rules in place, has high levels of trust in the government. I mean, there's a number of things that I would say Taiwan already does that are relevant for CPTPP in digital. What are some new opportunities? I mean, there are lots of new opportunities that come for Taiwan investment and Taiwan businesses heading out into CPTPP countries in other areas, everything from agriculture to services and so forth, and the reverse. But in the digital space, I would suggest that there are still some challenges that Taiwanese companies face when they go outbound that are related to restrictions in different markets, especially around services provision and whether you need to have a local presence in order to provide a service, what kind of licenses you might need or qualifications do you need to show in order to provide that service. Sometimes those can be impediments to delivering services trade from Taiwan into other markets. The TPP helps with a lot of that because it limits discrimination among members so that you cannot treat one group of CPTPP countries differently from some others. So that would give some advantages, I think, to Taiwanese companies who are trying to compete, again, goods, services, investment, et cetera, in CPTPP countries that you don't currently have. And I think that would be very helpful. In terms of getting, what would the current members get from having Taiwan in digital, especially? You know, Taiwan is clearly at the cutting edge of many digital trade issues, including not just the manufacturing and hardware side, but also innovative services. And I think that the ease of moving between markets that comes in the wake of a comprehensive and deep trade agreement is always helpful. And it would allow the current members in the CPTPP to more easily access and more instinctively think about Taiwanese collaboration than they might today. Because once you have a trade agreement that's under negotiation or signed, even if you're not using the specific provisions of the trade agreement, so you don't even know what's in the agreement, you know there's something happening. Businesses often act because they know there's something happening and they should be part of that market. And so you get sort of spillover and broader consequences to even just the launch of discussions, because businesses may not have, as they sort of think about the universe, they may not have thought of Taiwan as a destination prior to the discussions around TPP. But once you hear Taiwan and CPTPP together, you suddenly say in the C-suites, boardrooms, et cetera, maybe we should consider doing business in Taiwan. And so just that alone, I think, can help drive integration in ways that can be very useful.
Yeah, thank you very much. That is exactly the motive and rationale for Taiwan's government trying to get access to CPTPP, become a part of it. Thank you. I see one question raised by our ambassador, and he said his question is, apparently digital trade will be new normalcy in business in the future with or without COVID. And given Taiwan and Singapore's good capacity in digital trade, what will be the room for collaboration? So I'll raise this question first to Davey, and then I'll ask comments from other speakers. So sorry, so Davey, Rachel, sorry, from Singapore. Rachel.
Thank you, Christy. I think that that we see the room for Taiwan in participating in Southeast Asia as a strong role. I think that we have similar principles across how we engage with international norms. One of the areas that I wanted to call out recently is that in, especially for example, for Taiwan SMEs, I think that the ASEAN recently introduced the model contractual clauses. I forget exactly when. I think it was early last year. Sorry, time seems to have been a blur. And I think that, you know, even though it's a voluntary mechanism, it should pave the way for Taiwanese SMEs, for instance, to easily find a footing with ASEAN SMEs. Of course, the model contractual clauses still continue to need to percolate down to operationalization, but certainly there is agreement across the whole of ASEAN, so actually all 10 in these instances, that have agreed to those standards. And we certainly hope to see that across also certification, for example, which should pave the way for access for like-minded countries who operate by those rules of the road.
Very much. Do I see any other comments from other speakers? Davey or Patrick or Deborah, please.
If I could just say, you know, there is room for collaboration. I could imagine a digital economy agreement between Singapore and Taiwan, or Taiwan and Australia, or, you know, any one of the countries that has moved towards doing these digital only deals. I think that is an interesting angle that might be approached from the multiple parties. The point of these digital economy agreements, above all else, is to say we should have a consistent set of rules, and we should be part of the building of that consistent set of rules in the digital space. And I would have thought, or I would think, that Taiwan is well positioned to be part of that conversation. Again, given the importance of digital historically through Taiwan and of course into the future. So I think something around a digital economy agreement makes a certain amount of sense for collaboration. Also investment and skills building and so forth. I think there's a lot of opportunities, not just with Singapore, but with other countries in this region, for Taiwan and Taiwanese businesses to engage in that kind of interaction and collaboration. Building win-win outcomes is always, I think, very useful. So we don't need to wait for government to do things. You can do things business to business, business to civil society, academic institutions, you know, et cetera. I think that is very valuable in building up people-to-people ties in the region in areas that matter for both sides, both parties, or both governments.
Thank you very much. That is really very encouraging. And you know, we have a new southbound policy adopted back in 2016. And right now, this new southbound policy is moving into its 2.0 version, which will focus very much on digital economy. So I believe that may be an area that we can work further with our Southeast Asian partners. I have another question regarding the presidential election in the Philippines. And Patrick, the new president, Marcos will say that he will follow the Bill plan or initiative announced by President Duterte. And the participant would like to know what kind of, in your opinion, what kind of ICT infrastructure is more vital or more needed for the new government, and what possibly would be the priority in terms of developing a digital economy for the Philippines?
Thank you, and well, that's a challenging question, but I would like to step back a little in trying to respond to the question. So, well, as the world have seen, we recently had our elections, and former Senator Bongbong Marcos will soon be our president come June 30. And in his messages during the campaign and before, he stressed that the priority remains economic recovery. And this is hampered, as in any other country, by the threat of high inflation and slow economic growth. Particularly for the Philippines, this is related to our debt management. So the order of the day, I believe, would be for us, for the Philippines, to contain the surging commodity prices and arrest the rise of the price of consumer goods and services. So um, on the digital economy and digital transformation, I think it was Rachel and Devi who mentioned that with the pandemic and the digital revolution, it resulted in some irreversibles. So I would like to think that these irreversibles are the adoption of digital technologies. Lucky for the Philippines, albeit late relative to the others, we already started embracing digital economy. So our IT BPM industry, as mentioned, are consumer based that are now digitally connected and financially included, suggest that we need to accelerate. So to keep this up, and we need adequate investments. We need the adequate investments and the enabling proactive and policy business environment. Now, moving towards the question on ICT infrastructure, I think if this inflation and the more urgent priorities are addressed, I think we are ready to work on, as we already started, and I believe there are already infrastructures in place. As mentioned, we now have a new major player in the telco industry, and it has and started the um, the addressing the price, affordability, accessibility, availability of internet service. So little by little, we will be going there. I think I'll for now, without preempting the new and incoming administration, I believe these are some of the things that we have to work on moving forward. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. I think we still have time to address one last question. Let's come back to the U.S., okay? Because I think your leaders or the Philippines foreign minister just attended the ASEAN-U.S. Special Summit, and the Biden administration has announced his emphasis on digital economy. So from your perspective, what would be the priority for U.S. to work with Southeast Asian countries to develop a digital economy here in Asia, connecting with the U.S.? So can I see any volunteer to that question? Deborah?
I'll take it. I'll take it with the caveat, of course, I'm not in the Biden administration. But, their priority is to try to build up a coalition of like-minded, I mean, this is my phrasing, not theirs, but a coalition of like-minded countries to address a variety of issues. There are multiple pillars of discussion in Washington that are part of this overall framework. But the part of the framework that applies to what we're talking about is there's a pillar on trade. And in the pillar on trade is one element on digital. So this is, again, it's very complicated and it is what it is. But in that trade pillar is a digital element. And we will have to see what kinds of things are promoted by this administration. They're taking a different approach to the way that we do trade agreements than past administrations have taken. So this will not be a trade negotiation or trade agreement as we have seen in the past. It will not ultimately look something like CPTPP. It will be much more cooperative in nature and much less binding. And so we'll have to see yet what that results in, because members who want to join on to this arrangement can sign on to all or part of different aspects of this agreement, and the digital pillar is part of a large group of things that are sort of all or nothing, including some much more challenging topics for many of our Asian colleagues, like labor rights, labor standards, worker rights, environmental rules, competition policy. So I think it will be a challenging trade pillar or trade aspect of this framework. And it's one of the reasons why it was not actually discussed in detail at the US-ASEAN summit that we just had, because it's not yet clear whether all of ASEAN will be part of this framework going forward, or whether it will be some of those countries. So we are anticipating that the launch will happen at some point as the Biden administration heads to Northeast Asia, to Japan and Korea, that's when it will be launched. And then we will see who among the ASEAN members are prepared to be part of that first wave of participants, and in which elements of this complicated agenda do they want to participate.
I will touch on from different point of views.
Yes,
I think Deborah has touched on an important areas in terms of the regulatory framework and policies and trade policies. I think there is a huge amount of US digital tech companies that are able to offer either their knowledge transfer or technology transfer, and they will be able to help build the ecosystem in developing countries like Indonesia. So I think the room for collaboration and room for cooperation, even to develop a joint regulatory framework with the inputs from the digital tech players, this will be significantly helpful for even developing economies like Indonesia. So I would say the room for collaboration needs to be in place with all these US digital tech companies, because at the end of the day, they have the knowledge and they have the technology that will be helpful for the MSMEs.
Rachel, do it. Yes,
yeah,
Rachel?
I wanted to add from the perspective and building on Devi's point, absolutely, I think collaboration with companies like ourselves, Google is also committed to the training of SMEs. In fact, I think last week we did announce that we had fulfilled the commitment to train 3 million SMEs across ASEAN, which I think it's only beginning of the journey. You know, you saw the numbers of digital consumers and we spoke about that. So 3 million is big number, but still kind of far away from where we need to get to. I think that remains our commitment within the region, but also, as I mentioned, the enablers around digital infrastructure and building that out, and also even buttressing consumer trust in the privacy and security of the networks, which I think has to work in tandem with the rest of the sort of softer infrastructure, if you will.
Yes, I think in the future, Indonesia as the largest economy in Southeast Asia, or Google, the giant company here, can definitely play very important role in bridging the US and Southeast Asia to develop digital economy and improve digital gap. So I think the time is up. We have very wonderful and very fruitful discussion, and I believe that me, my colleagues, and all participants have learned from and enjoy a lot of this very informative and also insightful discussions. So on behalf of the organizers and co-organizers, I would like to thank all speakers once again, and thank all participants for staying with us for the whole afternoon. My thanks also go to all colleagues from CIR and from CSI for your excellent work, which make the webinar a wonderful experiences. I now announce the webinar is adjourned. Joseph, you may take it from here.
Christy. Thank you, Director, for moderating our webinar. And many thanks to the speakers for sharing your insights with us. We have come to the end of our conference. On behalf of TASC and CSI, I would like to thank each and every participant for joining us today. Kindly take a few minutes to fill in the post-event survey. Your suggestions or comments will greatly help us in our future events. It will be sent to you via email if you have registered with us prior to the event. You may also find a link to the survey in the chat box. And if you wish to receive news on our future events, please leave your contact info in the survey. There is also a link to download the presentation slides from our speakers today in the chat box. Also in the chat box are links to TASC and CSI's websites. You're welcome to visit our websites for additional information, particularly on ASEAN-related topics or Taiwan service industries. Lastly, don't forget, we will be here again tomorrow at 2:30 p.m. Taiwan Standard Time for another round of insightful and exciting content by our next group of speakers. 最后，请需要公务人员时数的与会朋友在意见调查表中务必填写完整的个人资料。今天和明天的意见调查表都需要各填一次。谢谢各位，我们明天再见。Thank you and hope to see you all tomorrow.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.